in looking at the issue of debt, we are very concerned with the economic sustainability of the East Africa community countries. This is because our mandate is within whatever country is added into the East African community. So in that case, at this point in time, we also consider the sustainability of a country like South Sudan. Now, as tax justice advocates, we come in from the angle that the problem at hand in the public financial management cycle is that there is inequality and manifestations of it in the whole economic cycles. This manifests at various disparities, and so whether it's gender, whether it's based on age and so forth, and among other aspects, tax is one of those spaces in which these inequalities manifest themselves, because you can have things like inequalities in agriculture, inequalities in housing, and so forth. Now, particularly in the case of taxation, the injustice that is mainly arising is that there seems to be an emergent system of big business and wealthy individuals dodging billions of their tax obligations. And then the result is that because governments are looking for ways to finance their activities, the tax burden shifts to the poor. And so tax justice efforts are therefore trying to address these injustices, particularly insofar as these burdens are shifted to the poor, because somehow the wealthy and big corporations have found a way to avoid or evade taxation. Just to speak briefly on the context, globally there is an increase in country debt repayments by 85% since 2010. For advanced economies, there is this long-term fiscal imbalance. They are finding themselves spending more than they are raising. And this is because of a lot of expansion in their government programs. And so they have to think of how to do that balance. Meanwhile, for developing countries, they are already in a weak economic state. The IMF estimates that about 40 countries in the region are either already debt distressed or at a high risk. And this is despite previous efforts like the Multilateral Debt Relief Initiative and the Heavily Indebted Poor Countries initiatives that were interventions to kind of ease the debt strains on these countries. Nonetheless, you find that post the global financial crisis, the question of bond issuances came up a lot. So countries have been issuing bonds that have increased from 1 billion in 2011 to now 6.2 billion in 2014. And the external debt in these countries between 2010 and 2015 has shot up by 147%. So you can see how the trajectory of debt is happening across Africa. Also, according to the Regional Economic Outlook, it's estimated that revenues in 15 of the 45 countries that have been looked at are less than 15% of their respective GDP. So these are the kind of statistics that are emerging across African countries. So as mentioned in Kenya, in that context, and also East Africa, there is quite clearly a situation where there is increased debt. But what is more unfortunate is that this debt is not resulting in productivity. Most of it is going back into repaying loans and budgeting for ballooning country wage bills. So we are borrowing from Peter to pay Paul across the East African countries. So the conversation about debt is increasingly about the risk of default because of the massive amounts of money that we have onboarded as economies. Secondly, there is the question of weakened resilience. This is particularly an issue now that you think of the shocks that are coming in the case of, for instance, the pandemic. So how that resilience that they had is very much weakened because of the debt. And this is because these countries are now, excuse me, greatly exposed to the global environment, the global markets, as opposed to when they were borrowing domestically, as was previously highlighted by Wanjiru when she was talking about Kenya only having a debt to finance elections, but now we have debts for all manner of projects. So initially we had debt that was borrowed domestically and could be easily restructured because since it was borrowed in the local currency, then the restructuring was easier. However, now that we have commercial loans, uh, restructuring that is very difficult whenever there are shifts in the global markets. So for instance, rise or decrease in the dollar, that affects, and for instance, that affects us. And if you look at the Kenyan case, now that the dollar has risen, I think it's now 108, our debt has also increased in a very short period of time, just based on weakening of the shilling. So when we speak of the linkage between the public debt and issues of taxations, we look at three main things. First is what I'd hinted on, the increased tax burden. If you've looked at the conversations in Kenya, maybe also in Uganda, if you're following, but there is a lot more burden on the individual as opposed to companies. If you look at the conversations about the digital services tax now, there was also a digital tax in Uganda some while back. But also, if you look at the continued conversation on trying to broaden the tax base, the government is looking for various means to increase its domestic revenue mobilization capacity. But it's coming up with measures that are increasingly very difficult on individuals. So if you look at presumptive tax, that was a tax that people were not quite happy with it, considering their obligations and so forth. Secondly, another linkage is the question of harmful tax practices. Other than just locally on issues like the presumptive tax and so forth, these practices like double tax agreements that are giving benefits to foreign companies and then disadvantaging local companies. So if you have companies that are operating in the same sphere and one is coming in from a foreign country, they have other benefits that are then kind of hindering our local entrepreneurs and so forth. But also, unfortunately, some of these agreements are resulting in situations where
Rosemary, please mute. Thank you. Leonard, I'll give you 1 more minute to wrap up.
So yeah, as I was saying, if you look at the harmful tax practices, other than just disadvantaging local companies, they are also opening up avenues for tax avoidance and the whisking away of incomes that could be taxed so that the government loses the opportunity to raise revenue. Thirdly is the question of distorted development. And here then you start seeing, because of the way things are all haphazard and not properly thought out, we have slanted taxation, which is not considered legitimate, and people just see this as an opportunity to now start avoiding taxes. You have now other attached effects like inflation, and then obviously things that emerge out of these like economic uncertainties. So for us, the questions on public debt relate to questions of fairness in tax policy in East Africa. They relate to the issues of harmful tax practices, as I had mentioned. Then obviously the questions of how economic growth and resource distribution in the region happens. And lastly, of course, the empowerment and inclusion of citizens in these policy making processes. Just to list on the questions of fairness, we have to ask, we find that in on fairness, we find that there's a lot about tax reforms. But what are these tax reforms in East Africa really about? There is also the questions about how do we fund political promises? The infrastructure projects have arisen a lot out of political promises. So when a government comes in, they have to look for ways to fund these political promises. And debt has been the easiest way to get money. But then to repay that money, the only way out obviously is taxation. In instances where there's this problem, then it means adding more debt. So there's that linkage to the issues of political promises. Then you have to consider the appropriate means to achieve the domestic revenue mobilization. So which taxes do you consider and how do you implement them? And then there is a larger political conversation we need to ask ourselves about how do you tax someone to become a more productive entity? So how do we get to those incentives or abandoning them altogether so that we spur productivity using taxation as a policy um, instrument? In terms of harmful tax practices, of course, there is a contestation about first, what are illicit financial flows? Now, a lot is said about the illegal activities that are involved in whisking money out of the country. But in terms of tax justice, we also think of the legal means by which tax is avoided. And so that question has to continue playing out. As tax justice advocates, we continue to say, look, there are also these legal means, and there's a lot more money that is whisked out that could help service delivery if we can tap that. There's also questions around the linkage to tax havens. Kenya is considering having its own Nairobi International Financial Center. And so there's a debate in that because tax havens are the key means by which money is whisked out of the country. And lastly, on that point is the question of emerging treaty networks. So you can't whisk out money out the country without having signed treaty networks. In the case of Kenya, which has the largest list of double taxation agreements at 48, plus if you combine that with the Nairobi International Financial Center, then you see how Nairobi and Kenya will become a hub for which a lot of these transfers of funds that will disadvantage government will be happening. Of the 48 DTAs Kenya has, 12 were signed after the Constitution of Kenya 2010. And these 12, if you compare to the previous ones before the promulgation of the Constitution, are badly written, meaning there's more opportunity to avoid taxes based on those treaties. Then when we speak about economic growth and resource distribution, we obviously have mentioned, based on my fellow panelists' contributions, about debt finance projects. One thing I think is very interesting to have a conversation around is to see the correlation between our hunger for PPPs and the accumulated debt that we now have. And following that, we'll obviously speak about questions of the challenges in revenue and resource mobilization. Of course, we've mentioned the issue of infrastructure-led growth and particularly of interest to members of the public and the citizenry is the stresses that we are seeing in service delivery due to the minimal resources available, plus mismanagement and general fiscal indiscipline. And lastly, we have to speak about empowerment and inclusion of citizen voices in fiscal planning. So we see PFM is already an exclusive policy space, but as the strain is continuing, the politics around it is that there seems to be instances in which officials are trying to isolate public finance management more by sidelining the people and their representatives. This is the heart of the issue if you look at the DTA case that TGNA put forward, where they singled out the Mauritius DTA, but following research, we've realized that 9 other treaties are also problematic and did not involve the parliament in just assessing their cost benefit to the country. So these countries are Iran, Kuwait, Seychelles, South Africa, Qatar, Korea, United Arab Emirates, India, and the Netherlands. Some of
Leonard, please
which,
wrap up. Kindly wrap
yes.
up.
All right, just 2 minutes. Just okay, I'll be done in seconds. Some of the countries mentioned here are some of the biggest tax havens. And so you can see how the treaty network is emerging. Public sector institutions are lacking the necessary resources and skills to empower people to build equal and inclusive voices. So there is limited public participation as it is right now. There's a lot of stifled political party debate. You haven't seen very robust debate about taxation or public finance management, unless it's something heated. But there's also a trend here if you think of the fact that as civil society, we somewhat shifted from civic education to more capacity building. Capacity building being training the people in institutions to consider the issues that we thought were important, thereby kind of reducing and neglecting the need to train citizens to be more vigilant. So why we are very happy about today's presentation and conversations is that for us, we see this as an opportunity to engage and implement an idea of having a tax justice forum in Kenya with like-minded organizations and individuals that will try and push public finance management and revenue issues forward a bit better. We want to mirror this with our Ugandan counterparts who have been very good at it. And this is a good opportunity in terms of even thinking through the public interest litigation strategies, engaging parliament, and so forth. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.